The HX Collective explores the human experience through three main channels of life: work, relationships, and self. With raw, authentic conversations, the podcast investigates how challenges can become powerful teachers, leading to personal growth and deeper connections. Rooted in humanity-centered design, each episode reflects a commitment to doing good and doing well, featuring diverse voices and generational perspectives. Expect gripping stories of struggle and success, with thought-provoking discussions and concrete tools and tactics that encourage you to rethink your relationship with distress, helping you to establish your full human experience. This is the HX Collective channel. Welcome to the next episode of the HX Collective podcast, where we are in for such a treat today. I cannot believe how excited I am as I am anticipating what I know will be a game-changing conversation with the one and only Andrew Benedict Nelson. And I have to tell you, to describe him as a strategist and a consultant doesn't even begin to put the layers of impact, design, disruption, and innovation that Andrew brings to everything that he touches. And what I appreciate so much for our relationship, Andrew, which is greater than, I'm saying we're a decade and a half of meaningful innovation work. I know today we are going to be introducing something that may revolutionize the way that people think about leadership development. And I don't say that lightly, because we're focusing on the application or the merging of what is commonly known as human-centered design and design thinking as it applies to product development and innovation and transformation, and where that intersects with leadership development. So Andrew, my friend, welcome. I'm so happy that we get to have this discussion. And before we dig into things, I'd love for you to take a step back and give us a little bit more about the background and kind of the through line of how your work and how it impacts the world. Let's start there, and then we'll give some additional information and notes in your bio when we post this with the show notes.
All right. Well, thanks, Deb, and good morning.
Good morning.
So I like to say that my career as it is began when I left graduate school and when I decided I didn't want to be an academic anymore. And I had no idea what I was going to do, moved back in my in-laws' basement. But I reconnected with a friend of mine named Jeff Leitner, who's also a friend of yours.
Great friend.
And he had a project called Insight Labs. And what Insight Labs did was, when organizations faced really existential challenges, entrenched challenges that they couldn't address themselves, we would put together a group of outside thinkers who would get together, usually for half a day, and everybody would put their heads together and either solve it or come up with an insight that transformed their understanding of the problem so they could solve it. And we started doing that with local groups in Chicago, but by the end we were doing it with all sorts of national institutions, State Department, NASA, Starbucks, Holocaust Museum, just about everybody under the sun. And so that was really how I cut my teeth as a strategist and a designer, was working alongside Jeff and the other principal of the group, Howell, in creating that. And really the subsequent phase of my career was taking a lot of those skills that I learned and translating them into an area where I have some subject matter expertise, which is healthcare and social welfare more broadly. And so as a solo practitioner, I've worked with a number of different clients. The big ones are Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the American Association of Critical Care Nurses. And all of these were problems of the healthcare workforce, taking on the problem of health equity, of racism in the healthcare system, and then also making sure that nurses have a healthy work environment. So that's broadly what I've been doing recently. And the only other thing I'll add is that through all of this, there has been a kind of constant education in design thinking and how to use those methods to make people more creative about the problems that they're taking on. So in a way, I've been doing design this whole time, even though I was never trained as a designer or anything, but it's always been an element of what I've been doing.
So first of all, I don't know that there'll be any other moment when our listeners are going to hear someone who's had the perspective of thinking about human experience through the lens of disruption that includes from NASA to Starbucks to the Holocaust Museum. I mean, you want to talk about a wide range of the human experience in such a diverse ecosystem of change and transformation. I also know that, when I look at the through line, every time there's an opportunity to think about creativity or design, the element of the human being seems like it's always interconnected. And so that it's not just think big thoughts or craft a new product or even a new service, but really, what does it mean for the human being to expand and grow? And I'd love to know, just like, what does it feel like when to be consistently at that catalyst space when you look at change and disruption? Like, I've never been with you or worked with you when you weren't in the space of challenging something that was going to be, a norm, and taking it to another level, or you take conventional, business models and, and awaken things. So tell us a little bit, like, what's that feel like to always be at the space where you're a catalyst for change or catalyst for disruption?
Yeah, it's funny. I just sat down with somebody who did a really interesting like personality analysis on me. His name is Tim Muir. You'd like him.
I'm sure.
But Thrive Personality is his company. And he pointed this out about me based on just an analysis that I did. And I was like, wow, that's really true. That essentially his description was, when I sit down to work on something, all of the pieces are in play. So there's no commitment to any existing practice, but it's also warm and personal and casual. He said, you're not a formal person. I said, that's really true. And I think that my experience of it, I always am kind of taken aback by the idea of like, oh, this has been some sort of, I don't feel like I've necessarily been playing at the Innovation Olympics for 15 years. I still feel like they're pretty personal conversations with people most of the time about how the pieces of their world fit together. And, there are lots of things in life that stress me out and that I find difficult, but I don't find that difficult for whatever reason. Of saying, okay, well, what if your life were completely different? And, you know, maybe that should stress me out, but it doesn't. And I think that I I find that space of possibility really comforting and really more comfortable than doing the same thing every day. I would say that that's a lot of what it's like for me.
Yeah. Well, I first of all, I think you've sort of given this new frame around how to access innovation through a more personable sort of mechanism and approach. So, and I think that's important because we're going to dig into some of the groundbreaking work that you're doing presently in leadership development. But I think it's important for people to understand that this isn't just an exercise of the intellectual curiosity, to spur or spark, a new model for the sake of it, but rather how to make it deeply accessible, to create a deeply relational approach to innovation. And I think that's something, at least as I've watched the deliverables of your work and the outcome of things that I've been a part of that you've awakened, there's always a tangibility to it. So I want to, kind of ready our listeners to recognize that while you do think some of the biggest thoughts, and you tend to mash things up in ways that you're like, I don't know that those things typically would be obvious ways to bring design ideas together. Yet what you create seems deeply accessible. And I think that's going to be a critical piece. Now, before we dig into your kind of newest foray into human centered design and leadership, I guess I'd take a step back again. And you mentioned healthcare being a pretty critical space in which you're operating and doing some awakening work. When you look back and think about elevating human flourishing, and knowing that the whole HX collective is focused on, uniting our efforts to lift people, what would you say as you examine the arc of the experience? Like, what are the essential things that, when you think people that you're serving are really flourishing, even in the space of really challenging or difficult, verticals or businesses or even the worldview? What are some of the things that they share in common when they have a capacity to flourish without regard to the circumstance or the context?
Yeah, yeah, because flourishing is a bit of a tough word for me because in the fields that I work in, a lot of people are really suffering right now. And even, in the past few months, concerns about the integrity of the healthcare system and the social welfare system, as much as we have systems at all, have, really gotten a lot worse and rightfully. But what I would say is that the people who I think are doing well and I hope to bring this about with my work is that they have integrity about it all. People people who are carers and healers didn't come to their work to work with people who were doing fine all the time, right? They came because they are aware of problems, whether it's the problem of us, all getting old and dying, or the problem of breaking your leg, or the problem of mental health, whatever it is, that's what they always expected to be dealing with in their work. So it's not that they're afraid of any of those things. It's that they need to approach them with a personal sense of integrity, which usually includes not just ethical integrity, but like scientific integrity and a kind of methodological integrity. And really the sources of distress that I see in people is usually not, oh my God, the rate of X disease is going up. It's, oh wait, I can't address that with the methods that I know are right.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the times when I'm working with people, it is around that kind of alignment more than some sort of, I don't need to convince people to be optimistic or to be hopeful. They've already got that in them, but they do need help connecting it with whatever their current situation is.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things that I just had a kind of like an aha moment. A lot has been said of late around bringing authenticity to the nature of the work, but you just took me a level deeper because the word integrity in the expression of authenticity, I think, is so keen. And the recognition that integrity can be both the integrity of, as you said, the systems or structures or the ethics or even the laws that come with engaging in the work in this context, healthcare. And it's also with like integrity within your soul, integrity within your calling, integrity within your mission. And so I think that's a really interesting play for me, at least, on the expression of integrity, where I may have been more prone to say authenticity. I also think when you look at the work of disruption and being a strategist and doing consulting and advisory in this space, I think there is that edge that people get to where all the conventional experiences, knowledge, know-how, resources, access, when you ultimately get to the end of something. And then the question is, now what? And how do we move through this? And I think as we transition to the work and leadership development, I think there is a common starting point that, notwithstanding all the experiences that you may have gleaned academically or all the work experiences or the exposures that you have, there is a certain recognition in every element of business and life that you're going to get to the edge of your own capacities. And so the question isn't that, well, just dig harder or white knuckle, but rather, how do you transform your way of thinking, or how do you begin to apply maybe a business model or a thesis or something that's worked in one context and try to import that into an area where it may not be as obvious or as conventional. So again, I think a big observation that I have, and I want our listeners to know, is that one, it's really normal to get to those edges. And it's really a question then, in integrity, what do you do about it? And then secondarily, not to only rely on our own conventional wisdom or even the wisdom of what others around us would say is normal. It's an opportunity to maybe look outside of our context to begin to get some answers, which leads me to why I was so excited to have this discussion. Because as an advisor and as a person who consults in the areas of growth and leadership development, you said to me, all right, Deb, I'm really excited about what you're doing here with the HX. And I'm really curious, about something right now that I'm working on, which is how human-centered design intersects with leadership development. And on one level, I'm thinking, well, leaders include human-centered design, but you actually are approaching this very conventional, necessary part of business and commerce and politics. Like, leadership is such an important construct, but then you're layering in sort of the disciplines and the mechanics of human-centered design. So share with us, if you will, your thesis. Like, what in the world are you up to when you look at the Venn diagram that intersects those two things?
Sure. So I guess that I would say where this got started for me, it was in thinking about healthcare, but what I've been working on, you could apply in just about any field, and I have applied it with folks outside of healthcare as I've developed it. Basically, where I got started on this, it was with seeing the frustration that a lot of nurses and other healers had as they moved into positions of leadership. And you could really see a lot of people floundering for a method that worked for them. And a lot of what is out there and is presented as leadership is, I hate to dismiss anything. I think just about anything can be a useful tool. But either folks are being presented with some form of management advice. some form of, in the case of running hospitals, a lot of it is financial, is fiscal, which has its place, but isn't the point of a hospital, right? The point of a hospital is to help people. And, knowing how to manage the money is important, but it isn't the mission of the institution. So anyway, folks are moving into leadership positions. And I think that especially people like nurses and physicians who are trained really to work on best practices as much as they could all the time really get thrown by how much unknown, uncertain there is and how much you have to make mistakes to make progress, which uh, certainly nurses are trained absolutely in minimizing all mistakes for the life of the patient, right?
Sure.
But once you're in a leadership position, you have no choice. So that's one of the aspects that led me to say, okay, well, actually, design thinking is a good method for this because the design thinking process, the human-centered design thinking process, really centers, okay, we're going to look at people and their needs. We're going to build for them, but we're also acknowledging that we are going to make mistakes along the way, that we need a prototyping process to incorporate people's feedback, and that we're always going to be in cycles of development, that we're never going to get it perfect. It's always going to be an improvement process in conversation with our users. And the other thing I would say is, as I described that, what I didn't like about it was that there wasn't enough creativity in it. I think that it's also important for people to understand leadership as a creative process,
Yeah.
that there is going to be imagination, there's going to be risk, there's going to be, staring at the sky and wondering what I actually want to do with this team or this project. And design thinking is a way to bring some structure and discipline to all of that. It's not the only way,
Yeah.
but it's a way, and it is certainly better than no way. And
Yeah.
so I built around that to create a leadership development method that really says, okay, you are running this software as a leader. You go to work and have an idea of what a leader is, and we can improve that software. We can say, all right, my leadership style, my leadership method is going to improve in response to the people I'm serving. Not an original idea by any means, right? There's servant leadership, there's situational leadership. This is just a technique, a technology that helps to really put all that into practice.
Yeah. Okay. So, first of all, you did such a great job of weaving in sort of the core principles of design thinking. And I think for context, in the event someone listening is kind of like, I've heard of that, but I'm not entirely sure. Can you give us just the short course? Because
Sure. Yeah.
when you describe it as technology and you describe the sort of human being as software, I think there's a lot of it makes my brain kind of flicker and say, oh, that's really a good, it's just a fresh way of looking at leadership. As you highlighted, there are so many methodologies that are kindred spirits, but maybe give us a quick tutorial on what are the active phases of design thinking, and then layering in now this concept of creativity. I think that will be useful to help people have even more context for what you're doing.
Yeah. So, well, let's just start with design real quick. People have been designing for thousands of years. The word design just comes from the word draw in French and Latin. And that's just, any kind of use of your imagination, use of your creativity to solve a problem. So design is what you think it is, right? There's no special definition of design somewhere. But the human-centered design thinking method was developed by folks at Stanford to really put people back at the center of the process, because especially as we had more development of technology, it was very easy to center the needs of machines or the needs of organizations. And so the theorists who developed this said, all right, we're going to start with users. We're going to start by articulating their needs completely apart from what we're trying to do. Right. And when I do this with folks, they are always surprised at how kind of emotional and unconnected to the work these questions are. I ask things like, okay, basically, what does this person want in life? And they say, wait a minute, do you mean from my job? No, from life. what
Yeah.
what is your observation about them as a human, right? And we got to start there, because we're really serving people as people, especially through leadership. You're not designing a better a better slide rule for them, right? You're designing an organization that they're going to spend their time in. So that's the first step, is empathy with the people you're serving. Next is defining the problem that needs to be solved, that they need solved. After that is ideating different ways of approaching that problem. I do all this through design constraints. So making a list of, okay, our solution needs to be, 20 feet tall and red and needs to have wheels, whatever your constraints are, right? But there's always multiple ways to address the same set of constraints. That's really where the creativity comes in the process. And then the practical step is moving to prototyping, which is something short of a full implementation of your idea that lets you understand the user reaction to it. So uh, that is almost always it's where failure happens, right? It's where you find out, oh wait, actually people hate this idea that I had, but usually in a way where it's not going to have pain, right? Where you're going to say, oh wait, that was silly that I forgot this thing, right? That was fun to learn that I forgot this thing. And that's what prototyping is really for, is activities that let you do that in a kind of safe environment. And then the process ends with testing, which I don't do very much of with the people I work with. But testing is just whatever processes you have in place to bring that user feedback back into the loop. So to say, okay, yeah, a year from now, we're going to see if this worked for the people who built it. And so I usually talk more about the intention of testing than actually doing it with people, because it's a longer term engagement that I don't do as much of. But so overall, that's the process. It's the way the steps are normally named is empathy, definition, ideation, prototyping, testing, and you'll find that on websites across the universe. I didn't come up with any of that. All I did was adapt it to the problem of being a better leader.
Yeah.
Um,
So I think that's what's so cool about this. So then
Thanks.
the proof of that methodology has been, as you said, well documented, well tested, but it would almost seem like if there was a place where you would start with the user desired outcomes, the person's wants and needs globally, big picture, not in the context of the job they're doing for you, but rather who are they as human beings and what do they require ostensibly to be the best version of themselves or to flourish. It just seems like such an obvious intersection with leadership. And yet, I'm not sure that when people apply the disciplines of different leadership methodologies, that they've necessarily applied that design starting point and then looked at the end users in the same way that the adaptation and the predictability of the ideation and that prototyping, with the expectation that you're going to fail or learn. I would say both are one and the same, that there's
Absolutely.
real impact in it. So taking then this concept of design thinking and then applying it with some of the more conventional aspects of the roles that leaders are to play and how we're to grow our impact and being effective leaders. What do you think are some of the new outcomes that are achievable, I should say, using this application of design thinking?
Well, I think that to me, the most immediate outcome is freedom. And what I mean by that is that almost all of our ideas about what it is to be a leader are inherited.
Okay.
And people will do formal training in leadership, but most of the time, and this is what I talk about with people in the first session. I say, when I say leader, who are you thinking of? And a lot of times they're thinking of like their old boss. And sometimes those are good memories, sometimes they're not. And a lot of times people are saying, oh man, I hate when I'm going to have to do this thing that my old boss did. And it's like, well, actually, you don't have to do that. There may be a completely different way to go about what you're describing. And this is I have friends who have found this out across all areas of design, that simply taking out the pieces and saying, okay, so assumption 1 is this, and assumption 2 is this, and assumption 3 is this. Do we like any of those assumptions?
Yeah.
Maybe you keep most of them, but at least you have the moment to say, okay, I actively chose these, and I know my reasons for doing it, and I'm going to go ahead with that. And I actually think that outcome of freedom or agency is more important than any particular decision, because a lot of leaders don't actually feel like they have a lot of agency, especially in complex systems with lots of layers. People feel like they're just a functionary, and there's some truth to that. But we can design within those limits and say, we're going to give you as much agency as you can, while you are vice president of X.
Yeah. Okay. So I think I'm following, and I'm looking at this idea. So, all right. So leaders across organizations, there is a certain level, there are design constraints relative to the organization, the financial responsibilities, the
Mhm.
organizational, constructs, policies, procedures. So that, as you said, there are things that can feel like a leader is in that kind of functionary role. And yet the flexibility to take what is expected of you. And I'm thinking the thing that keeps coming to mind, because we're at that time of year, we're filming this in Q4 of 2025. And, we're in the dreaded performance review season, right? And for a lot of people, giving hard giving performance feedback that's anything other than like checking the box off of a template or having to give hard feedback. And in a lot of ways, I'm sure for leaders, we sometimes see leaders, they'll save the news until the end. And then you've got an employee or someone working for you that feels a little bit surprised or feels a little bit, like, wow, I didn't see that coming, or I've been hoodwinked. I had an expectation and it wasn't met. Can you give us a really practical application that you've seen where the leaders have been able to extend their creativity and still operate within the constraints of their organization? Meaning, you got to get the performance review posted in order for the person to get their merit increase, and maybe performance reviews isn't the right application, but what would be an example that you've seen work with a human-centered design or a design thinking approach to leadership development that increases that feeling or experience of freedom for leaders?
Yeah, well, I think that the example that came to mind when you described it is, I mentioned earlier I work with American Association of Critical Care Nurses, and they have a set of standards that they call the Healthy Work Environment Standards, and those are generally meant to be applied in practice settings. And so it's things like authentic leadership and clear communication, but it's not just a set of principles you put up on the wall. It's all pretty well documented what effects these have on a clinical environment. Anyway, so AACN has an office as well. They, have 200 plus employees for their organization, and they implemented the healthy work environment standards within the organization. And one of the areas where they did it was performance review. And
Oh,
I got to do some research internally on how that's going. And as you might imagine, there is a kind of bell curve of results. Not everybody knows how to give a performance review using something as aspirational as that, right? So I'm not trying to present it as some sort of magic bullet, but when it worked really well, what you notice is that folks are evaluating themselves in terms of their contribution to a greater whole, and a greater whole that in no case is complete, right? No one works in a perfectly healthy work environment. Everyone has static. And so really learning from some of those, they call them people leaders, which I love, learning from some of those folks how to really talk about how the leaders who are under them are contributing to that or not, and where there's room for growth. I really like that because it it isn't some absolute judgment on you as an individual, which this work isn't anyway, right? I think about all the time that in school we're always evaluating people individually,
yeah.
but in most of our lives it's all a group project, you
Right.
know? And I think that being able to shift into what the group project is, which is really making a healthy and productive work environment, is helpful. Now, so I'll call that out because that had nothing to do with me. I was just describing it, right? I mean, I have set some chances to help think about how to improve it, but that does really strike me as something that was designed. The healthy work environment standards were designed, and I've been fortunate to help in some of their design improvements and implementation. But I think that anything like an evaluation is a great example of something where you could break down all the individual elements and say, okay, we always do this, and we always do this, and we always do this. And is all that crap actually? Like, should we get rid of these elements? Because most of the time you could, right? There are very few things where you could say we absolutely have to do it this way. But if you have one, great. You say, okay, the evaluation has to be done in a formal setting. The evaluation has to be done with X number of observers. Take that, say those are the constants, and we can change anything else. We can get creative with anything else about it. And then you're designing. I mean, even if you just, I often use silly exercises with people just to say, okay, could we all be in our pajamas? Yes, actually, we could. Are we going to? No. No, we're not going to do that. But as long as it's not one of those constraints you already have in place, you could change it. You could do it differently. And so that's what I encourage people to do is to say, here are the constants, here are the things that we can change, and then let's get creative and explore within those boundaries.
So the thought of taking something as rigid as a performance review process and beginning to open our minds that the things that make it in our minds rigid and dreadful and painful, what I'm hearing is that when you really start to unpack it, and you get clear about what are the standards of expectation, you suddenly have a lot more field to work with, including there's nowhere in our constraints that says we can't do this in our pajamas. Again, as an example, extreme example to say, how
Yeah.
can we stretch our ability to see the performance review as an essential ingredient to a healthy environment, healthy work environment? Like if we start to, as leaders, go, I can't wait for this moment of time called performance review because I see it as a leader as one of my access points to really drive the outcomes of a healthy work environment. Am I tracking with you? So it's
Yeah.
shifting like the thing that maybe feels like it lives in the space of dread based on all the parameters and the rigidity that we're thinking of it. And what I'm hearing is how to just take that very simple expectation as a leader and shift it, design around it in a way where you as a leader can authentically approach it, but with that sense of anticipation and enthusiasm. And then I can only imagine then for the user, in this case, the employee, what that will feel like when they're in the performance review receiving process or engagement process. It probably dramatically changes how they anticipate and benefit, if you will, from the outcomes. Again, am I
Yeah.
tracking so far?
Yeah. And
Yeah,
I would say, I guess I'm not an expert in this area, but I do think that there are, talk about something where we're running thousands and thousands of trials, right? That out there in the world where you could go and talk to a dozen different organizations about how do they do this. And I do think there are some design traits of something like a performance review that work well and could be easily imported into organizations. So the first one that I thought of was people should know what the heck they're walking into
yeah,
when they I mean, and I think that unfortunately in a lot of organizations that sense of surprise or suspense is weaponized, which just makes no sense. But overall, I used to train kids to take the ACT, and we would a big thing we would do is say, okay, we're going to come into class and we're going to put a form in front of you, and this is going to be just like it is on the ACT, down to I want you to have your number 2 pencils, and we're going to evaluate it. You're not going to be able to raise your hand and say the answer. You have to bubble in the answer. And so I think that with something like a performance review, you should create that environment that anybody can go in and say, yeah, I know basically what's going to happen to me. And this is management 101 stuff, but people should already know what's going to be talked about
yeah.
in a performance review, right? I would say that, maybe there is an opportunity there for some creativity and some aspiration, and to say, okay, so, and this is an area where I'd love to use designing leadership, the method I put together, which is to say, okay, so we're going to plan out the next year. What's some stuff you'd like to do? Where would you like to grow? What do you think that you haven't gotten a challenge to yet? And say, all right, is there a reasonable way to incorporate that into your career as you grow? Because most people don't really have that. I hate to say, I mean, most people are just going to their jobs and saying, did I do my job today? Great. And that sucks. That's boring, not to have any area where you can grow. Right.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I guess so on a really practical level, here's what I'm taking away from this, and I'm wondering again, just so that folks can track with what you're doing and maybe begin to see how that would apply in their world. So I picked performance reviews in large part because that's often a place of leadership, dread, or it is often in a space of like a very almost bureaucratic or administratively focused function and doesn't really get to the idea of human flourishing. Like we don't
yeah,
see
for,
the
for the boss too. Bosses don't like doing
they're
that.
right, exactly. So everybody, so here you have this like construct that I think, let's be honest, I think it was designed originally with some of that healthy work environment. Like we want our people to know where they stand so that they can do a better job and set goals. But yet for a lot of us, we don't have that actual experience based on the system. So what I'm hearing is number one, what would have to be true about the performance review process in your workplace as a leader or as the employee? What would have to be true for this where it would be the catalyst for human flourishing? Like what would be the features or the aspects of the application of this process where the outcomes for the giver and the receiver of that feedback would be like, whoa, best hour I've spent all year. And when we start to challenge ourselves to think about that outcome and that circumstance, I think that's where design thinking really can be a great asset because we're looking at it from the vantage point of stakeholder joy or stakeholder growth, boss and employee. And we're also saying, well, like, how can we play with this experience to design different ways to apply what could otherwise be dreadful in a way that actually becomes something that people look forward to or people
Yeah.
long for. And so I think
I,
that's a lot of what I'm hearing in the challenge of designing leadership is that you can take the static, normal, boring, hard, dreadful, perfunctory aspects of leadership and start to say, what if?
yeah.
What if this wasn't this way? Like, what would have to be true about it? Am I tracking on this application?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that so not only can you apply all sorts of imagination in it, I think that you can apply a kind of honesty in it about how organizations and teams function now, because in very few workplaces are people just straight up taking orders from the boss and fulfilling them military style. Heck, even the military doesn't work that way anymore. I mean, there is an absolute sense somewhere in the system that you must obey orders, but most work in the military too is teams, and a lot of collaboration across groups. And so to begin with, I think you can say, okay, well, what does this organization actually function like? What kind of work are we doing? And what is an appropriate way of evaluating for that? But then the other thing is, I think that there's no reason not to design with the users on an evaluation process. I mean, it would fulfill what we were just talking about, which is you'd know what was expected when you went in, and you could actually say, hey, yeah, I chose that, we were going to list 3 strengths and 3 weaknesses or
Yeah.
whatever, right? It could
Whatever
be
I
anything.
want.
But I just don't see any reason not to give people that kind of agency, because it's not like they won't be evaluated. It's not like they're going to say, in my evaluation, I'm going to get a peppermint and I'm going to get a puppy. No, like if you sit for 5 seconds, people will take it seriously,
Sure. Yeah.
and they want their colleagues to be evaluated on appearance and what is my word? In a
Fair.
fair and serious way.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
Furious. I mean, we'll go with that too.
Yes.
Okay, I
Oh,
love it. All right,
yeah.
so for purposes of other areas that might intrigue our audience's curiosity, so we've used performance review in that system and again, I love the idea of inviting the users into redesign or to co-design. You know, if the performance review process was the catalyst for human flourishing, like what if that were like what would that process look like? What would be the content of that exchange? How might that exchange elevate outcomes for both the receiver of that feedback and the giver of that feedback? I mean, I think that's a really awesome consideration. What other areas of leadership development are you tackling with this type of designing leadership methodology so that we can at least begin to think, how might I consider other aspects of leadership which could benefit from a human-centered design approach?
Sure. So I would say that the most interesting and consistent pattern that has emerged when I implement this with people is, so we think of you're a leader of your direct reports, right? But when I ask people what groups they need to influence or to have on their mind to succeed in their roles, they almost always expand beyond their direct reports.
Okay.
And a lot of the most creative insights come from saying, okay, wait a minute, I need to satisfy this desire of the clients, this desire of my colleagues in management, and this desire of my direct reports. How am I going to do those all at the same time? Oh, wow, creative solution I never thought of before,
Got it.
right? That is actually designed to do more things than what you thought it was designed to do. And so I think and there's a lot of talk about managing up, right? That's an aspect of being an employee today in complex organizations. And I think that this type of process kind of brings that in naturally, and I guess managing sideways as well, how you relate to your colleagues. But, I'll tell you, one of the people who I did this with, I just loved what he designed with it, which is he was talking about how all the people who needed access to him, and which included clients, right? And he created this approach of doing ongoing education and development in his workforce that really was all about giving everyone access to him, but satisfying their various needs by centering a concept. Or this was a digital marketing company,
Okay.
And so, he would say, all right, everyone's asking about AI, right? So I'm going to give a presentation on AI, and we're going to invite the clients and other management and employees, and we're going to answer everybody's questions. And it was just such a different way of going about something that, he could have done in a sort of, well, everybody's going to watch this webinar or something that could have been totally boring. And so I think that really opening up the kind of like social graph around what leadership is and who's involved in it, I think that there's a lot of potential in that. And it's really something liberating that we need, because I think that at this point, everybody is tired of the Napoleon style
Yeah.
leader.
Community
Nobody
control.
even pretends that works anymore.
Right.
And so, but people don't have something off the shelf that they can replace it with.
Yeah.
Right. And so I feel like I'm kind of in the middle here of saying like, all right, well, but we could build that together. And you already have it inside of you is the thing. I don't need to train you in it. You just need to kind of recognize, oh, wait, I'm actually pretty good at this. And people like it when I do this. Maybe my leadership can be about that. Right. And not about, barking orders at people.
Yeah, for sure. So I have two additional things that I want to make sure we have in this
Yeah.
conversation. So on a really practical level, if somebody wanted to take a meaningful step forward and start to reimagine the social graph, by the way, I love that term or phrase, like going to grab that one, in the construct of what it means to be a leader in an organization and how to think more holistically from the vantage point of all your users or stakeholders, and then begin to say, all right, how do I solve for, in your example of access? So instead of operating in that space of scarcity, there was an element of I'll create more abundance, because not only will I achieve an access outcome for three stakeholder groups, but something unique may occur in the way I'm delivering, where those other stakeholders may gain a different kind of access by simply having a shared experience where employees and clients are interacting, in a manner where colleagues, direct reports, and clients are having a chance to learn something, but in an environment where they get the access to one another as well. It's just sort of shifting our limits to begin to see, how do I solve for an outcome, but how do I look at it through the lens of those stakeholders and those users? What are some practical takeaways? Like if somebody was like, all right, I want to move the needle in becoming a more human-centered, designed leadership contributor, like what are some practical things? I always think of this like the 3 by 30. Like if I could do three things in the next 30 days, are there some practical steps that you would encourage folks? And I'm going to say step number one that you don't have to say is like people will be able to access you and deepening that conversation. So apart from engaging you or reaching out to you to go deeper, what are some practical things we could apply right now?
Yeah, I mean, I would say this is a kind of quick and dirty version of the method. So, number one, think about the people around you. Everyone who you need to influence in your role, and think about them as people. I think you kind of have to do that in whatever way works best for you. I tend to think about people's faces. Just think about them, irrespective of situation or job. I'll think about them in the context of their families or their communities. Just say, okay, yeah, this is a person. They have needs. They have assets and challenges, just like we all do.
Yeah.
And so start with that would be the people. And then I would say, whatever those people's needs are, there's lots and lots and lots of ways to meet them. And if you limit yourself to one, you're shooting yourself in the foot. I feel this way as a parent sometimes, where, I need to remember, okay, my son just needs to have some sort of physical activity today. And, is it going to the park? Yeah, most days it is, but it can be that we play Floor is Lava, and he jumps all around our living room and then helps me clean it up at the end, and he's learned a different lesson, And so I think that we need to do that as leaders too, which is to say, I'm focusing on the need that's there in the relationship, not the particular way of satisfying it. And that can help you be a lot more flexible and creative. And then the last is, what I call in the process prototyping, but prototyping is really just trying something. I would say whatever your obstacle is in the way of trying, redesign so that isn't an obstacle anymore. So if it's too expensive, we'll figure out a cheaper way. If it's that's going to take a year to plan, figure out a silly short way of doing it, even if it's just telling a story. I mean, that's one of my favorite prototyping methods, is get everybody in the room and say, okay, imagine that we did this and then this happened and then this happened. How would you react? That's authentic prototyping right there. You don't even have to build anything. You just have to take people through this thing that's in your head and get their response and be willing to learn from it. As long as you're willing to learn, it's probably prototyping. And there's a possibility of failure is the other thing. But that's, like you said earlier, they're
learning.
just two sides of the same coin,
Yeah,
failure and
they
learning.
are. They are. So I'm hearing. So let me summarize then. So again, I think if we can pause as leaders and really start to think about the people and the stakeholders that we're responsible for, whether it's up, sideways, or from that direct report, and start to really look at them as humans and the requirements that they have in a larger context, not just in the role or the relationship you're having in say in a limited context at work. I love this idea of beginning to understand from a design perspective, how do we look at what the outcome is? And actually, human-centered parenting is maybe something we'll do next in a
Yeah.
conversation, but just this idea of, all right, so if we accept that the outcome of physical activity or the outcome of, one-on-one or dialogue or conversation, how might we consider the context in which that dialogue or conversation can occur so that we're not so constrained by one singular experience in a rote or sort of prescribed way, but rather really play with that in a manner which might give us a more expanded view of ways to achieve better outcomes. And then I love the idea of prototyping with the full recognition that, just trying things on action and movement fail fast. So you get the benefit of learning is one of the ways to continue to keep advancing in your leadership impact. So I love those are three practical things. And I'll say, the fourth thing I'm going to encourage folks, if you want to take a deeper dive and really look at this through the lens of your specific organization or your specific stakeholders, you'll have an opportunity to connect with Andrew directly in the show notes. So last question, and again, it's poignant. I mentioned we're in Q4 of 2025, and it's a lot happening in this calendar year, notwithstanding right now in this present day of November of 2025. But I guess what I would ask for you, Andrew, when I think about the whole reason we're doing the HX Collective and the podcast to as a mechanism, like what's the hope we have for the world? And so when you think about 10 years from now and standing in that future where the human experience was elevated and that human beings were flourishing more, what are the things that give you hope that that's even possible?
It's that everything around us was designed and we can redesign it, which is cribbed from Steve Jobs. I can't get the quote exactly, but and I'm not a CEO worshiper by any means, but if there was one I was gonna call out and say this is the guy, it would still be Steve Jobs. And the idea that, everything you experience, somebody sat down and said, okay, when you go to the DMV, first you're going to sit in this big pen. And then second, you're going to get a number. And then third, this is going to happen. Someone made that decision. It isn't just the way that it is. And you could redesign it. You could change it. You could change one aspect of it. You could change the whole thing. And there is no doubt that a lot of the stuff around us in the next 10 years is going to have to be redesigned.
Yeah.
And that's great. That's the thing, is that, you look at something like, oh gosh, what if I, in my area in healthcare, it's always, oh my gosh, is my health insurance going to change? Is my doctor going to change? Right. Well, I think at this point, people know it is, right.
Yeah.
It's not going to be the way it was that you imagine it was in the past. Right. But we have opportunities to make things better and to make things really different than they have been. And it's just so easy to forget that
Yeah.
and to think my job is just to survive this. And it's like, no,
Yeah.
you're that's that's not that's not what we're going for here. We're not just
Absolutely.
going for trotting through this. We're
Yeah.
going for making things great. And
Yeah. That's
but I think that we're at a moment where that's starting to creep back in.
yeah.
And I think that maybe it's just because we've got so many crises going on that we know we don't have any other choice. But that's a good thing,
It
is
is.
to be able to say, all right, we're going to do things differently than they were before.
Yeah.
Is it scary? Yes. Is there risk of failure? Yes. But it is way better than just saying, all right, this is the way things is and I have to knuckle down.
I love it. So the key takeaway I've got is that to elevate human flourishing, we have to remember that everything is design. Thank you, my friend, for an awesome conversation. Can't wait to pick up our next one. And I just wish you a great end of year and can't wait for more opportunities to connect with the HX Collective. Be well. Bye now.
Thanks, Nick.
Thanks for being here. If today's conversation sparked something in you, we hope you'll carry it forward with curiosity, compassion, and courage. Subscribe to the show, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who needs it. Until next time, keep exploring what it means to be fully human.